Hey everyone, this is kind of going to be a little surprise video as I really didn't announce this anywhere, so surprise. So I just wanted to do our first top video for this week. I did not receive any suggestions, so I picked two, and I'm actually going to keep both of them a secret, and you'll get to find out as I post them this week. We'll have two, this being the first. We'll have the second one here in at least 2 or 3 days. Maybe I'm voting for two to happen. So basically, to really get a maybe hint of what this topic is, I'm gonna give you a little thing here. If I mention England, if I ask you mention the first thing that comes to your mind when I say Great Britain, or if I say England in particular, odds are one of the things that's gonna flow through your mind is, oh, the Queen, or they have a king, or they have a queen, they have a monarchy, basically. Well, that is true. Now, how many of you might know that for 9 years in its history, Britain and England did not have a monarchy? You're probably looking at me right now and you're like, oh, I never heard of that. And I think you're lying. Well, I am not lying. For today's topic, we are going to hit the English Civil War, which happened during the 1600s. Probably part of the reason that none of us probably remember it is because it happened so long ago and we really just don't care about history that much, do we? So we really don't study anything outside. And then if we do, we typically won't study anything that the high school teachers don't make us learn. So most of you probably don't know this. So we're going to start today with the English Civil War. And this, again, marks the only period in history where England, or Great Britain, if you will, was not ruled by a monarchy. It was a form of a republic. Although eventually they did restore the monarchy, and we will hit that as we go here. So let us delve into this topic of what exactly would cause the English people, in their majestic right, to get rid of their monarchs, which today is actually, they love their monarchs. The Queen Elizabeth II is like beloved in her country, even though she really doesn't have as much power as what we monarchs back in the day had. She's still very much beloved by the British and English people. Well, British, English, same thing, blah. People, they love her. So that's just that. So let's get us into this topic. Again, we're going off the handy-dandy history notebook. I think that's what we're going to give this thing. The history notebook of wisdom that I write down stuff that I've either known or stuff I've had to research. Most cases, this stuff I know. But in this case, this is one of the few topics I actually had to learn some stuff because I didn't know a whole lot of this. This is one of the few topics that I knew about, but I, in person, did not know every detail. So let us start here. And what is eventually going to start the English Civil War, what's going to lead to it, is this concept of absolutism. And we're going to just explain what that is here in just a second. Well, where did this come from? Well, let's think back here. Let's go back in time. This is probably, actually, I think this is the furthest back in time we've gone in any video. We're going to 1603. This is before even the Pilgrims were over here in America. We were just starting... The English were just starting to come over here. The Spanish had already been over here in the Americas. The English were just really starting to come over. So let us start here. And that we're going to start with none other than King James I, who you may not know who that is, but if you're a Christian, you've probably heard of the King James Bible, and that is named after King James I, who was very Christian himself, and ordered by his decree that the Bible be translated into English at the time, which is where we get the King James Bible. It's named after him. But he's also the same king that the Pilgrims run away from because he was very strict in how you could be a Christian. You had to be Anglican, and we'll get to what that is here in a second. Anyway, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, as we kind of know her as, she never married, never had any kids, and she never had some other things either. But anyway, she died in 1603 after reigning for, I want to say, at least 50-some years. I don't exactly know how many years it was. But she died, and Elizabeth, since she had never married and never had a child, she had no legitimate heir to take her place. And the heir to the crown, the British crown, or English crown, we're going to call it English, because back then, Great Britain really did not exist. It was just England. And England, Scotland, and Ireland were separate countries at this time. They were not united. So when we say back here, we're going to say England because mostly when you were a ruler, you really ruled over England and Wales, maybe. But Scotland was still a separate entity until this. In 1603, because Elizabeth had left no heir to the English crown, I'm going to have to correct myself here, her first cousin, King James VI of Scotland, was offered the crown. Now, of course, King James VI, he takes the crown, and he not only retains his title as being King of Scotland and King of Ireland, he's already no, he actually gains that title, so my mistake there. He's King of Scotland, and he takes the title, and thus he becomes not only King James VI of Scotland, as he already is, but he is now also King James I of England, Ireland, and Wales. And this kind of starts his reign. Now, James was he was very Christian, but back in this time, there was a very high conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And if we can recall even further back here, in about 1530 something, I could be wrong on the decade, but I know I'm in the right century here. King Henry VIII, the guy that had 7 wives or so, I think. It was either 6 or 7 wives. I forget. I think it was 6. I could be wrong, but he's the guy that had a bunch of wives. Well, Henry VIII, he was married first to what was her name here? Catherine, I think, was her name. Catherine, yeah, I think that was her name. Yeah, Catherine of Aragon, and she was, of course, the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain, King Ferdinand and Isabella, who ironically are the same people that financed Christopher Columbus's voyage. But anyway, she was Catholic, and he wanted to eventually. Of course, we all know Henry was very driven. He wanted a male heir. Catherine gave him a daughter who became known as Bloody Mary when she became queen. That not a good chapter. Well, Catherine could not give him that male heir, and Henry eventually got so sick of this, he said, okay, I want to divorce you because I want to find me a woman that can give me a male heir. And so he wants to divorce her. Well, of course, the church isn't too happy about letting him divorce her, and because they denied his request to do so, Henry breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church and basically almost exiles Catholics out of England and forms his own church, which is Protestant, and he calls the Church of England, which followers are then known as Anglicans, or the Anglican Church. And this kind of became the continuing conflict between Protestants and Catholics in England, where Catholics were kind of continually and more resentfully being persecuted, and Protestants were also being persecuted by the Catholics. It was just on and off, on and off. Well, James was very Protestant, because Scotland was a Protestant nation, and he had been raised that way. But there was this new movement among the Protestants called Puritans, which is what the Pilgrims were, and they had some very strict values that they wanted to believe in, and they thought it was right. Well, James wasn't a big fan of these values, and he was very persecution to them when he would do this. And this is going to start a cycle here that's going to lead to an English Civil War. Sort of, not entirely. Well, anyway, James was also a very firm believer in the divine right of kings, or absolutism. Now, you might wonder, well, what is the divine right of kings? Well, the divine right of kings is not really a right that's declared by law. It's more of a theory, and it was more of a thinking at the time, that a king or queen is appointed by God to their position, and that they have absolute authority over their kingdoms. No one is higher than the king or queen, and no one can tell the king or queen what else. They are answerable only to God. James was a very high proponent of this. He very much believed that he was divinely appointed. Well, we kind of got an image of what that happens when monarchs kind of get that view, and it usually don't roll over too popular with the people. And it didn't roll over very popularly in England either. Now, Also, because James was already king of Scotland, he merged all three crowns that he held, the King of Ireland, the King of Scotland, and the King of England, and he merged them into one and kind of ruled them consecutively with each other. They were not personally unified yet. That wouldn't happen until roughly 100 years later, into about 1703, that they would eventually all merge into one united kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which is what we know that the country has today, even though Ireland broke out in 1921 and Scotland is kind of showing some independence movement of its own. But anyway, the United Kingdom itself does not exist yet, but this is the first step to those countries getting unified into what they are now. Well, most of them anyway. Well, because he then merges the crowns, and he is now the big main leader of all three countries, and four if you count Wales. Well, in order to do this, of course, this is also where we're going to get the name here. James gives himself the title of King of Great Britain. This is where he is the first monarch of England to use this title to describe what he is. So this is where the name Great Britain mostly comes from. And it was come from the old Roman word for what was England, because back in Roman times, when the Romans had colonized southern England, they had called it Britannia. So he kind of took the name from the Romans' version of what their name had been for the island, and just said, okay, Britannia, Britain. Kind of Englicized it, or however you want to call that. Now, of course, now that he's merged these crowns, of course, that he's Anglican, he's Protestant, James tries to enforce Anglican laws across all three of his kingdoms that he now occupies. And of course, this ups resentment and repression of any Puritans, any Catholics, or anyone that's not Anglican in the church. Now, James eventually dies in 1625, and 5 years earlier, because of this big group of Puritans set sail on the Mayflower, they went over here to America, and they landed at Plymouth Rock, and we kind of know the story from there. But they were fleeing England because of King James I. And that's why they fled England, was because of him. Well, anyway, 5 years after that, James dies. He served a long life. He passed away of natural causes back then. And his son, Charles, now takes the throne, and his son now becomes King Charles I. Now, I'm going to show two pictures here. We got historical figures today. See here, this is a photo of King James I in all his wonderful glory. He was also, ironically, the King of Scotland at the time. This is him. This is James. His son, upon his death, Charles I, looks like this. This is the one that we're really going to have a lot of pivoting about. Now, Charles, just like his daddy, because he was raised by daddy, he is also a very high supporter of this divine right of kings as well, because, of course, being the son of the king, he's probably going to have the same view. And he's been heir presumptive. So that's going to bring us through the absolutism phase. Now we're going to get to where tensions are going to start rising in England. What is going to push this nation to a civil war? This is not like the American Civil War where states tried to secede from the Union. No, this is caused by something else. Charles was when he took the throne, he was very heavily backed by the nobility and the gentry, is what their category was called. And the gentry was basically common wealthy people. These wealthy, rich people that weren't nobility, but they were rich. Now, most common people in England, like the farmers, the merchants, they were not exactly very high supporters of this little divine right of kings thing and everything else. They wanted some say and power for themselves in the English government. And they were very high supporters of Parliament having a more equal or more power than the king should, in order to give them a say in their government. Now, remember, Parliament does exist at this time, and at this time it's more just to advise the king. It's not really got a separate distinction. So at this time, there is a Parliament, but it's not as powerful as it is now. And the people are starting to evident and prove, well, we want Parliament to have more say because we can elect those members. We can't elect the king. But if we get a chance to elect our members and the Parliament's power is expanded, then we get more of a say in what we want, how the country to run, which sounds good. It's kind of a democratic ideal. Well, Charles, being this divine right of kings guy because of his daddy, he's not a real big supporter of this, but he kind of feigns it. He fakes it. And in 1628, he basically acts like he's concurring with this because he agrees to a petition of right that year in 1628, 3 years after he takes the throne. And in this petition of right, it basically just says, as a first kind of restriction on Charles's power, that the king couldn't raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. And it sounds like a good democratic thing to start kind of limiting a power. Well, bear in mind, Charles is not really a big supportive of this, and he's just faking this. And he kind of backstabs him almost, because Parliament was not required to meet every day. It was actually usually called into order by the king. Had to be called into order by the king. Well, Charles simply discovered, well, if I just don't call you into session, I don't got to worry about you, do I? And he went over 10 years without calling Parliament into session. And in the meantime, raising taxes, defying this law, in a blatant violation of what he just agreed to. Well, Charles, of course, and his administration, they continue James's policy of trying to rid England of the Catholics and the Puritans and anyone that's not strict Anglican followers to the church, to the Anglican Church. And he basically, he kind of drops some of the Catholic persecution, and he really starts focusing on the Puritans and Presbyterians. The Puritans are mostly in England, and there's a lot of Presbyterians in Scotland. And of course, because he succeeded his father, Charles is also King of Scotland and Ireland and all that. He inherited that title as well. In fact, every English monarch, I think, from then on has mostly held that title until Ireland broke away until 1921. So, like, Queen Elizabeth II today is not labeled as the Queen of Ireland, but she still has that over Scotland and Scotland and Wales and England. So that's a different matter there. Of course, this policy was also enforced in the other kingdoms, as we mentioned. This kind of builds up tension between the king's administration, where he's not involving the people like he promised, and the common people who are starting to see Charles as kind of backstabbing us here. And they're kind of getting angry with the king and his administration. And in 1642, this is going to be the pivotal year here, the Scottish Presbyterians grow so fed up with the persecution and everything else that's happening in their country to try to convert them to the Anglican Church, that the Scottish Presbyterians eventually actually get so angry they rise up in armed revolt and invade England through Scotland. And this starts Charles to immediately start panicking in his right. And although he's never called Parliament into session for over a decade, all of a sudden he makes the call to Parliament that, oh, I need you, because it's required by law that the king needs Parliament's help in declaring a war. Well, he automatically assumes that war, like any king, is going to make them loyal to me again. They're going to rise up and support me. Well, unfortunately, Parliament was kind of sour about not having met for 10 years, and as soon as they get into session, like, Charles, we're not doing this. And instead, Parliament, under the direction of 5 distinct members, of one of them is a very famous guy here, by the name of Oliver Cromwell, they kind of they don't declare war on the Scottish Presbyterians that are invading England, but instead, according to my wonderful notebook here, they remove the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name is William Laud, who had been one of Charles' main directors to try to Anglicanize these Puritans, Catholics, and Presbyterians. He had been really the headmaster of this campaign to try to do that, of the Anglican conversion efforts. They remove him from his position, so he's out of power, and they declare that it is required by law that Parliament must be allowed to convene at least one time every 3 years to try to avoid Charles from doing another 10-year absence again. Well, of course, Charles is angry that Parliament has now gone the opposite of what he wanted. They've gone against his wishes. They've gone against him. They've trying to limit his power, and he's furious. And Charles, in his wonderful wisdom, comes and storms Parliament with his personal palace guards. And he comes with arrest warrants for those 5 members, including Oliver Cromwell, demanding that they be turned over to him because they are committing treason for having denied his demands as the king. Well, Parliament instead issues protectionary measures, partly dubbed by Cromwell himself, and basically says that any act against its members by Charles, any act against its members is an act of treason against the nation. Charles, in response, he declares the Parliament is now dissolved. I don't need you. Blank you. I don't need you. Well, unfortunately, this is the spark that lights the powder keg. Now the people are so fed up with Charles, and now he's dissolved their voice of reason in the government. He is now almost absolute authority in the English government, and the common people have had enough. And they start, it ain't pretty. They start rising in revolt. Parliament issues the protectionary measures against any act that Charles may do to them, and then basically, as Parliament's dissolved, the Civil War starts to break out. And this is now, we're in the war. This is where things are going to go. So the first major conflict between the two sides was the first major conflict here. There were multiple wars, but this was the big main war, and it was mostly between the supporters of King Charles, and those of Parliament, and this would last until around 1646. This was going to last at least 4 years, kind of like our Civil War here in the United States. So, just like in our Revolution, where we had people that were supporters of American independence were called patriots, and American colonists who supported the British Crown were known as loyalists, the English had their own kind of terms for different sides of the war. If you were a supporter of the king, you were commonly known as Cavaliers. If you were supporters of Parliament, you were known as Roundheads, because a lot of them would have these very neatly trimmed haircuts. Not like mine, but a lot neater back then. Remember, they didn't wear wigs at this time. It wasn't until just about 10 years later that wigs actually became a fashion in England. And basically, the parliamentary Roundheads, they start raising a volunteer militia army that they raise into this new model army, is what they call it. And under its command, they put former Parliament statesman Oliver Cromwell into command of this army, and it was composed of a mixture of these different religions. You had the Presbyterians, you had the Puritans, you had the Catholics. They were all working together only because they all saw a common enemy in Charles, and they all start uniting in their hate for him. Now this right here is a wonderful picture of Oliver Cromwell, and he's going to be a dictator in his own right here for too long. He's part of the reason we English Republic didn't really work out, and we will discuss that here shortly. Now, Charles also created his own army, but he uses the old medieval method of commission of array, which allows a king to call upon the inhabitants of an area to serve him without pay, basically. You are serving the king. And this is still unpopular, but there's still a lot of royalists in the country that come to Charles' aid and join him in his army. Charles also gets battlefield assistance in his command from having not only royalist commanders come and join him, but he also has his nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, which is actually a nephew that lives in Germany, was a prince. He come over to help, and he was very adept on the battlefield. And he even puts his 14-year-old oldest son and heir presumptive Charles II, who would become Charles II later on. He puts him on the battlefield. The guy's 14 years old and have to command armies. Real nice parenting. Anyway, the first battle during this war becomes known as the Battle at Edge Hill. And it was very indecisive between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads that were going against each other. But as the war kind of goes on, it rapidly starts to turn in Parliament's favor, because Parliament's armies, the new model army, starts winning all these victories, and then Parliament's taking a lot of control of the major cities in England, such as London and, what's another one here? Bristol. They're taking a lot of control of those major cities. And eventually, they win the major battles at the battles of Marston Moor and the Battle of Naseby. Now, then, shortly after Naseby, the Roundhead New Model Army under Oliver Cromwell starts to besiege Oxford, England, where Charles is holed up. Charles escapes before the siege can really begin, and he flees to Scotland. He flees to the Scottish into custody of the Scottish Presbyterians at Newark. This kind of is going to mark the end of the fighting of the big main war. Now, the Scots kind of negotiate for a year. He was captured in about 1645. They kind of negotiate for a year with the parliamentary forces for about 9 months. It wasn't quite a year, but almost. And eventually they hand over Charles to parliamentary forces, and he is taken into custody. So the war is basically now done. We have the king. What are we going to do now? Well, the problem is Charles is now held under house arrest. And he is not allowed to leave that house until his trial could begin. Parliament was going to give him a trial to see what his fate should be. Now, of course, there's some in England that wanted to preserve. They didn't want to. They wanted to dethrone Charles, but they did not want to kill him because they deemed, well, he's a king. Do we really have a right to kill the king? And then there's others like Cromwell who are highly suggesting that a king is answerable to his subjects to any crimes he may have committed, and it is his responsibility that he did those things, and thus he must be punished accordingly as to the justice that befits the crimes that he committed against his subjects. Well, at the trial, Charles he's accused of treason against England and its subjects, and he was accused of this by using his power to pursue personal interests rather than for the good of the country. He was trying to do his absolute divine right of kings rather than what was good for the people. And let it also be kept in mind that the funny thing here is, this is a funny fact. This really doesn't have to do with politics, but Charles, he was known, let me get the photo here again. If you notice, Charles had a beard and a mustache, and he kind of had long hair on him. Well, he had all this by a personal barber of his, and when he was in house arrest, the parliamentary forces that were keeping him under house arrest would not allow him to see his barber. Because of this, Charles was so paranoid about his hair, he wouldn't allow anyone else to cut it. And so by the time the trial begins, he's got hair flowing down almost down to his chest. His beard looks like an old Russian beard that you'd see off an old czar. He let his hair grow only because he's paranoid about someone else cutting his hair. That's just a funny fact I thought about add in here. But throughout the trial, basically, as it goes on, Charles refuses to really plead guilty when he's asked to by the parliamentary trial. And he even kind of calls the trial illegal. He said this trial is not justified, it's illegal, it's against the law. And basically he says that it is illegal because since his authority had been granted by God and traditional English laws, the court had no jurisdiction over the monarchy, which, of course, was a matter of debate. Well, the prosecutors, who also include that wonderful Oliver Cromwell, this wonderful dictator, wonderful guy, they find Charles guilty of treason against England, and they state that Charles is guilty of all, and this is in their own words, guilty of all treasons, murders, rapings, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs to this nation. They find Charles guilty, and the court sentenced Charles to death by hanging. Well, not by hanging, but they're actually going to behead him. First it was hanging, they're like, no, we're going to cut his head off, because that's how we kill a king! Which is kind of odd, because, ironically, when the French get rid of their monarchy for a brief period in the 1790s, they ended up killing their king by beheading too. Kind of odd. I don't know why that is that we think we got to kill monarchs by beheading their heads. I guess it just looks so pretty. Well, anyway, they sentence him to death, and the Parliament, in direct contradiction to Charles's claim and kind of a rebukement of him, they state that the King of England was not and is not a person, but it is an office, and that its occupants are responsible for their actions, in a blatant rebukement of what Charles claimed, that he was a person and he had divine right, he was appointed by God, and they're saying, this is like an office, and anyone that holds that office is just as responsible as any politician. Doesn't matter if you were born into it or not. Charles gets allowed to say farewell to his children that are left. Now, Charles II is on the battlefield, and he's trying to work out diplomatic negotiations, really, with the parliamentary forces to try to save his father, but they're all in vain. They do not work. And his remaining children, he has a couple daughters and another son that will also later become king in a way, but we'll get to him here at the very end briefly. We're not really going to talk about much about that one. But anyway, they're still with him. They get to see a very tearful farewell to their father, and he loves them and everything else. He gets to see him before he dies. And Charles is then beheaded at the Palace of Whitehall in front of the banquet hall, in front of a big public mass. He's beheaded on January 30th of 1649. And just before, when he went to the beheading, Charles asked the executioner, he made a brief speech to the people, saying that he is at the very end, basically, that he was going from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, still holding that belief to the end that God was going to see him as a wonderful king. Yeah, I'm sure he will. And then before he tells the executioner, before he kills him, that allow me to pray for a moment. I will not keep you long. I will allow me to simply pray for a moment, and when I reach my hands out, you'll know when to strike the blow. Of course, the executioner actually agrees. He allows Charles to do this, and Charles, for one time, true to his word, after about a minute or two, puts his hands out, down goes the axe on the neck. The head's pulled up, they show it to the entire crowd, but there's really not that image of traitor, because it's still an English king. This is the first time they really beheaded a king. They don't know what to do. And they eventually sew Charles's head back onto his body and put his body into a lead coffin, put him in buryment. Well, Oliver Cromwell is now where this is going to take place now. The king's gone. And Charles II, although he's assumed to be the king, he kind of realizes that the people are not with him. They don't want the monarchy right now because they're mad at his father. And he leaves and flees England along with his brothers and sisters into France. And he would live there for the next roughly 8 years. So the king, the heir successor, is now in exile. So now England, for the shortest period and only time in its life, basically becomes a republic of sorts. And this is the first and only time in its history that it has been so. And I'm not saying it couldn't happen again, but so far this is the only time in its history that it has been so. And this republic becomes known as the English Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell, who had effectively led the model army and most of the parliamentary forces, he becomes basically the leader of this republic. And he becomes increasingly dictatorial in his rule, though. He seemed like a good guy at first, but he increasingly puts his own friends into power, makes explicitly Puritan mandates, where Charles had made a lot of Anglican mandates that you had to convert to Anglicanism. Oliver Cromwell is now making, basically, you got to be Puritan. And the Puritans could be a little bit eccentric. I mean, if you look at their record here in the colonial America, they were about the same way. But anyway, he kind of is no different than Charles was in that regard. Now, Cromwell purges, as another sign of his dictatorial nature, he purges the model army of anyone who disagrees with him and his government's policies. And then his Puritan regime, he launches a war against any Catholics, any Presbyterians, anything. Basically, the alliance that these religious sects had kind of made, sex, not sex, different matter altogether. We're going to say that now. S-E-C-T-S. It kind of sounds similar, but it's not the same word. I want to make sure I'm getting that clear out. I do not mean the other word. It may sound like that, but it's not that word. Now, the second word I just said, that's the word. We're not talking about that. So I just wanted to clear it up in case anyone misheard that. I kind of realize that can sound very similar. But anyway, these religious institutions, we'll call them that better, that way we're not have to debate that word again. These religious institutions that he united against Charles are now already, as soon as he's gone, starting to fall apart, mostly because of Cromwell. And Cromwell kind of launches this war against and he even invades Ireland and tries to get rid of the Catholics in Ireland because he starts fearing that they're supporting a restoration of the English monarchy. He's paranoid, basically. And then, in order to make the regime weaker, and what makes it even weaker here is that the army and government couldn't remain united as they had been, and they're now fighting with and quarreling with each other. Kind of ruins the whole purpose. Nothing could really get done in this new government that was going to aid the English people. So that kind of is the short-sightedness of this republic. It really wasn't working because there was just so much division and a power vacuum that had to be filled without the monarch. Well, eventually, we're going to come here to the monarchy being restored. And this is going to start upon Oliver Cromwell's death. Cromwell died after only 9 years as the leader of this English Commonwealth. He died in 1658. Well, Cromwell's son, Richard, he is now basically he succeeds his father basically as the de facto leader of this government. But he's much worse than his father because he's very ill-equipped to even lead a government. He doesn't really know how to, and he's just a terrible leader. He doesn't judge well. And this really ups pressure, and eventually this combined with the rife division eventually causes him to resign. He leaves his position. And then their military leaders are also forced to resign because the common people are starting to finally get sick of this strict puritanism that's being enforced by the military leaders of the Commonwealth. And it very much looks like another civil war is going to break out, or that there's even going to be a form of anarchy, because now, shortly after this, in 1659, Richard, just before he resigns his post, his government ends up being dissolved and replaced by another form of the government in the Commonwealth. And this really brings the people to, they're just so sick of this, and it's basically almost anarchy in England. And out of fear for this, Parliament is fearing that we're going to have anarchy in this country, and they're like, if this is what a republic's going to be, if it's worth this much trouble, just bring the monarch back. And they literally do this. And Parliament, out of fear here that the country's just going to end up destroying itself, they're like, maybe we ought to just offer Charles's son the throne back and let the monarchy be restored, because things might work better if he agrees to some conditions. So Parliament sends General George Monk to meet with the exiled son of Charles, who is also named Charles, but we're going to call him Charles II, because that's who he will become. He meets with him by this point he's living in the Netherlands. He's in exile still. His brother and sister are still living in France, but he's living in the Netherlands. And this happens in 1660. They offer to restore Charles to the English throne with his title and everything, and his family. But only if Charles promises to grant amnesty to anyone that was once his enemies in England, basically anyone that went against the monarchy. You must grant them amnesty, and he also must grant religious toleration for his former enemies as well. If they want to be Catholic, let them be Catholic. If they want to be Protestant, let them be Protestant. If they want to be Anglican, well, Protestant and Anglican are the same thing, but like if you want to be Anglican, okay. You want to be Presbyterian, okay. You gotta tolerate that, and you gotta grant us amnesty. You cannot charge anybody. Of course, Charles kind of sees England, and he kind of also wanted to restore his throne. He's like, you know what? If that's the price I got to pay for it, so be it. I mean, we came to blows. Because even Charles kind of realized his dad wasn't exactly the greatest man in certain regards. And he agrees, and Charles even promises that he will rule in cooperation with Parliament, and something that his dad had failed to do. And this kind of sells them over, okay, let's bring them back because we don't want anarchy. And Charles then sails to England after Parliament accepts Charles's terms, and he arrives on May 25th, 1660, into the country, and he's crowned in London on the 29th as King Charles II. Before we show the picture of Charles, he kind of looks like his dad a little bit. So right here's his dad again, the one that got beheaded. This is Charles I. And then here is, here, this is Charles II, his son, who now becomes the restored English monarch. Like father, like son. But basically, after this, Charles kind of breaks one small rule. He does charge 5 people, but they were like people that were highly even resented by Parliament, and Parliament actually concurs and helps him do this. They charged 5 people that were very close allies with Cromwell, and they charged them with treason. And they even though Cromwell died and he's buried in Westminster Abbey at this point, they dig up and get him out of his tomb. They leave his daughter buried there. Cromwell's daughter had died too, and they chose to leave her in there. I think she's still in there to this day. But Cromwell's body is dug up, and along with these people that are still alive, even though Cromwell is dead, they posthumously charge Cromwell's body with treason, and they hang the body. And then they end up cutting the head off, and that's a whole other story we won't get into. But that ends that. Now, Charles II, basically, the English monarchy is now restored, and people feared, well, what if he turns out just like a dad? Well, Charles II actually became a pretty decent king. He really did. He really didn't do a whole lot of bad stuff. He actually helped England more than he did. When they had the Great Fire, Charles was really good in helping rebuild London. He took care of the English people. He very much fulfilled what he promised and set out he was going to do. However, there was still that religious infighting in the country, and Charles left no heir when he died. And here's a cool fact for anyone that lives in the United States here, that the Carolinas were formed under Charles's reign by people that were very loyal to him, and he gave that land to them. And in fact, Charleston is named after him. Charleston, South Carolina. Back in the day, it was called Charlestown. But the Carolinas are named they come from Charles's reign, North and South Carolina. And I've been to South Carolina and North Carolina, but more in South Carolina. So I could say with definitely they're good states. Real nice. And I've been to Charleston. In fact, I'm wearing a Charleston shirt. I'm not lying. But anyway, Charles, when he dies, he also does not leave a son. And his younger brother, James, is now going to become the king as James II. Well, James is a Catholic. Uh-oh. And that causes big resentment with the English people. They don't trust Catholics. And eventually, James is actually forced to abdicate after about 2 or 3 years of his reign, just because he's Catholic, basically, and he starts faming Catholicism. And he lives the rest of his life in exile in France. So he reigns for like 2 or 3 years, and he's kicked off the English throne, basically, just for being Catholic. And I think it was his daughter, yes, it was his firstborn daughter, Mary, who will become Mary II, basically. She and her husband, who she married out of the Netherlands, known as William becomes king with her. They have to rule as co-monarchs. None of them has a distinct authority over the other, so they rule together as a dual monarchy with the title of William and Mary. William becomes William III, and she becomes Mary II. They rule as co-monarchs until William dies in a horse riding accident, and Mary dies. I don't know what she died of. But anyway, one of them, I think it was 1703, 1701 or 1702. And then Mary's younger sister, Anne, becomes Anne I of England. And she's kind of a robust, chubby little woman. And she only rules till 1714, and then she dies. She has no heir. She has no children of her own, thus ending the Stuart dynasty that had begun with King James I about 100 years prior. And the throne is passed to her second cousin, George I of Hanover, who starts the Hanover line of kings and queens, which includes that wonderful, insane King George III, who we all in America love and just love to talk about that guy. But it also ironically includes Queen Victoria, so brings us up to about 1901. So anyway, I'm not going to go too deep into English monarchy here. But that's the gist of the English Revolution. Not English Revolution, but the English Civil War. So that kind of covers this surprise little topic. I hope that was somewhat interesting, given the fact that when I first heard of the English Civil War, I was surprised to hear that England had ever had a period without a king or a queen. But it shows that even in the country that would seem least likely to get rid of them, they very much will get rid of them if they need to be. But anyway, that covers that topic for this video. Now, the second topic I want to keep a secret for the time being, although I will give you a hint, it's another civil war. But it's not an American Civil War. But this one will be far more recent, but I'll let you try to guess what that is, and you can find out when I do the video here later this week. The only biggest hint I'll give you, this one happened in the 20th century, and it kind of really shaped the modern world in a certain country. So we'll get into that later this week, but we'll keep that a secret for now. So basically that is concluded for this video. Now, as May comes up, as I know next week is the first beginning of May, next week we will do one on the Battle of Berlin, which kind of ended pretty much next week. That'd be 75 years ago. I know it already started, but I'm going to do it when it ended, and we'll talk about the whole thing. And then so far for May, I really don't have much planned, except for May 8th. We will definitely do a video because of the factor May 8th is known as VE Day. On May 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered in World War II. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Well, this year marks 75 years since the end of that great conflict, and as celebration of the end that finally came in Europe, and we'll do another one when VJ Day comes in, I think here, I forget if it's August, if we celebrate in August or September, I have to look. But anyway, we will do a video on that day of what happened, the German surrender on May 8th. That's the only one I've got planned out in May. Oh, and then on the 26th here, we are doing one on Chernobyl. I will probably do that a day late, though, so probably next Monday. So next week, I already got 2 topics picked out, but if you want me to do a third one, let me know. And I'll definitely include it in there as a third video if we need to have one. So anyway, that's what we're looking at right now. But basically, that's all for this video. So if you liked this video, if you thought it was very interesting, be sure to like it. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you maybe possibly want to see more that are coming, or be browse through any of the ones I've already done. So that concludes it all here. Stay safe in the coronavirus pandemic. I know there's a lot of controversy right now because the states are reopening, but we'll have to see how that really goes here. But hopefully everyone's staying safe during this pandemic, so continue to stay safe. Don't breathe the corona. And we'll hopefully see you all back here later this week. Have a good day, and farewell.